Well, good morning, everybody. I have two jobs here today. The first is to introduce the speakers. Now, that's going to be pretty easy because many of you probably already know them. The second job I have today is to keep them to time. That may be more challenging because they're both talking about vitally important topics and they've got really valuable things to say. So let's move quickly on. First, Harry Clark, a long and successful career as a researcher, chief scientist at the AGRC, previously a member of the Climate Change Commission and co-chair of the livestock group of the Global Research Alliance. Harry, you're going to talk to us about new tools and technologies. You have 20 minutes starting now.
Thanks, David. I better not waste any time then. No, usual thing is, can I get this to work? I've been asked to talk about modelling mitigations, and in particular, obviously we're investing very large amounts in New Zealand in technologies and tools, but how are they going to, if successful, will they meet the goals we've been set? Will they meet the government targets? So myself and I would like to acknowledge Andy Reisinger, Sinead Leahy, and Mark Aspin, who've also been involved in this modelling exercise. We tried to set out to say, if successful, where will we be? In 2050, what will be the trajectory of emission reduction if the technologies that have been worked on are successfully developed? But before I do that, I think it's rather go straight into the modelling. I'll say, well, what are the things we've been looking at? So I'll just describe some of the things we've been looking at, and particularly within the framework of the NZAGRC. So Naomi presented yesterday this kind of 6-objective strategic plan, and I want to just cover very, very briefly some of the elements of the objectives 1 to 3, because they're the technologies we were modelling. And there are some real caveats around this modelling. It's very much a suck it and see exercise. It has a lot of not tenuous, but assumptions that could be challenged. And it is very much an interim approach. And it's an interim approach for many reasons. And one is because of the early stage of quite a lot of the research. And these are just some of the things we're looking at right at addressing some of the fundamental aspects of science. For example, can we intervene early in life and then reduce total lifetime emissions? So is there a window of opportunity in a developing ruminant to intervene, and in that intervention, that single perturbation early in life gives a lifelong change and lifelong reduction in emissions? A very challenging process, but it would be very efficacious if it could work. Another thing that we've got to address is this issue of productivity and methane reduction. If you go back 30, 40 years ago when I studied as an undergraduate, we're always told if you reduce methane, the energy's there, it will get converted into animal productivity. Sorry, it doesn't work like that. It's not as simple as that, because we're not finding, in general, that reductions in methane lead to productivity. It's very, very variable. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But for an adoption by farmers, we probably need to address that. Can we actually have either multiple interventions or develop interventions that address that twin issue of reduced emissions and increased productivity? What about, as Peter said, you're perturbating an extremely complex system? Does the perturbation get overcome very quickly and you go back to steady state? How good are these approaches in the long term? Do we need to understand better the mechanisms by which they decrease emissions and mechanisms by which they can overcome that decrease? So we need to be understanding that. Genetic modification. Are there genetic modification approaches that could lead us to technologies, and this one particularly looking at that ryegrass is going to be talked about later today, that could lead to sustained reductions. So then we say, we've got those very basic ones. What about when we're looking at the feasibility? What happens when you stack technologies? Are they additive? Or they're not? Are they antagonistic? We need to really understand that. We're really focusing and investing much more heavily in the vaccine, in inhibitors, and in nitrous oxide inhibitors. Really trying to push those through. We know that they're possible, but can we get them into feasible technologies? And then, where are we at with really pushing towards solutions, things that we know are going to work, but how do we get them developed to that stage where they're commercializable or can be implemented by farmers? And a lot of that is very much focused on animal breeding. It is the one thing we know that works. With sheep, we know that there is a commercial service offered to farmers, and we need to push that now in dairy and sheep. And we've got another solution which in plants is like plantain, which we know is being worked on very strongly for nitrate leaching, but how does it work with nitrous oxide and methane? So these are the kind of technologies we were having to assess in our modelling. And when you actually look at where on the development pipeline these technologies are, so many of them at that early stage, they're all in the development. There's not many that have got to the stage where they're currently adoptable by farmers. And that can be from research elements. They still have to go through regulatory approval, etc. So there's quite a long process. So when you're actually trying to model the future, you've got to understand that there's a lot of uncertainty in the present here because of the very early stage research and the uncertainty around many of these things. So I will go on to the modelling. I'll finally get to it. So what does the current suite of GHG mitigation tools, how far can it take us to the government targets? So how do we approach this? So the first thing we did, and thank MPI, and so Joe and his colleagues are here, they've done some estimates going out to 250 as to what the emission profile will look like out to 250. And that is with some existing measures. So that takes into account there'll be some land use change, to forestry, it takes into account there'll be changes due to water legislation, etc. So that gave us some baseline emissions. Then we go, well, what are these technologies? So we had to identify the technologies we would include in the modelling. And then you get into the difficult bit, because you have to say, when are these technologies available? What are they going to cost? What's their efficacy? And then even more difficult, we've got those, what's the uptake by farmers? Because you've still got to know what the uptake by farmers is, and how long does it take farmers to get that uptake if you're trying to predict out 30 years. And so we used expert opinion on the costs and efficacy, because we don't have data on a lot of it, because it's early stage development. And we use this model called ADOPT. It's a model developed by CSIRO, and it's a behavioral model. It really works on two elements. It works on quantifying or describing the characteristics of the farming population, and it asks about 22 different questions, and some of them address farmer behavior, things like how profit-driven they are, what's their attitude to environment, what kind of advisory service they have access to, so it characterizes the population, and then you have to characterize each individual technology. What does it cost? What's its efficacy? Does it need upfront investment? Does it need new technology and new skills to adapt it and implement it? Once we've got that, we get these two clear things coming out of the ADOPT model, which is the peak adoption and the time to peak adoption. Then we can look at what the emissions are with those assumed peak adoption and time to peak adoption. And then we have to combine all those mitigations from individual technologies into a prediction or a scenario of future emissions. So there's some really critical assumptions. This is very interim work. It's our first attempt at it. So when we look at this, we don't know in detail what the cost's going to be. We've had to make some quite big assumptions around that. We don't know when they're available. So there's low certainty for most of those. Another thing is about the ADOPT model. Now, it's parameterized on past behavior, but we're in a very different situation with greenhouse gases. Yes, they may cost a farmer, but there are massive societal commercial pressures to adopt. So, for them to take up these technologies, does the ADOPT model actually work in those circumstances? Are we in a different situation? And then we have to bundle these mitigations together. What happens if 3 mitigations are available at the same time? Which one does the farmer take up? We have numbers for each individual, but which ones do they take up when 2 or 3 are potentially available at the same time? Well, we've had to make some assumptions around that. Don't look too closely at this. This is just how we got to where, with the individual technologies. So there's when were they available, what their estimated costs would be, and we did this using a shadow price of carbon, and if the cost to reduce emissions was less than the shadow price of carbon, the farmer would make a profit. It was greater than the shadow price of carbon, the farmer would make a loss by implementing it. We then have the time to peak adoption predicted by the model. Now, not all technologies are applicable to every sector and every component within a sector, so you have to understand that. And then we had to have the efficacy. And a lot of that is still very uncertain with term to efficacy, both short-term and long-term. So what are these initial results? What does it tell us? And so if we look at combined CO2 emissions, if these technologies are successfully developed and adopted as we are predicting, emissions would fall by 250 to about 75% of what they are now. Now, remember, we have a net zero target for the country. It's not necessarily an agricultural target, it's a net zero target for the country. If we look at agricultural methane, it looks as if we could get somewhere into the range of the 24 to 47% that the government has set as a target. Potentially, with lots of caveats, we could get into that range, but it wouldn't be at the top of the range, it would be closer to the bottom and mid part of that range. But there are some really quite big sectoral differences. As you can be expected, that dairy, much closer management of animals, and other sectors where there is less opportunity to intervene. And so with dairy, yes, you can get some sensible reductions, and a range of technologies can be implemented. We look at the sheep sector just as an example. Less technologies would be available, heavily reliant on a single technology. Simply because a lot of the technologies where if you have to feed every day, it's not likely to be applicable to sheep. So there is obviously quite big sectoral differences. And so if I summarize this, and I really do want to say these are interim results, this is our first attempt at this, and I will say what we're going to do next. So if successfully developed and commercialized and adopted by farmers in the way that we've assumed, 75%, a reduction to about 70% of current of the 217 baseline by 250. The emission reduction could fall within the range of the target set by the government, but they'd be closer to the bottom end of that range. But, and there are lots of, I should put but, the impact of these technologies is highly varied by sector, and the scope for reduction varies widely. And interestingly, the national impact relies on a couple of big technologies. And for bromoform here, we didn't differentiate between synthetic and non-synthetic, applied either by seaweed. But if we don't get a couple of big hit technologies that are widely adoptable, we will not meet those targets. So there's this heavy reliance on a couple of technologies at the moment. So some really big caveats. Approach is transparent. We can repeat that. And it's semi-objective, if I'm being optimistic. But many of the assumptions are highly uncertain. And they're coming from expert judgment, and those assumptions will change over time. Expert judgment will change, and our knowledge will change over time. And this matters not only for the efficacy of these mitigations, but also for the modelled adoption rates. And one thing that we've done an analysis, and although there are 20-plus questions asked within the ADOPT model, it's highly sensitive to a couple. And anything around adoption by farmers is highly sensitive to that profit element, which is, it's not, it's not brain science to work that one out. So very small changes in the cost of technologies can make big changes in their adoption levels. So just bear that in mind. And so what we're doing about the efficacy and adoption scale is fairly conjectural, but it is the results of discussions and traceable expert judgments. And anyone interpreting this data, please keep those uncertainties in mind. And these will change over time as we remodel and get better information. So really, where next? We're undertaking a strong review of this modeling approach. We've been talking to the developers of the ADOPT model and looking to see can we get some better evidence that it is the right kind of model for this approach. We're looking at developing more robust processes for gathering the inputs into the ADOPT model, and also getting a lot better, more inclusive judgments on those assumptions around cost, timing, and availability. And really, that's where we're at. And I think that some of you may well have been contacted in the last couple of days. So we've got Andy Reisinger and Mark Aspin here going around asking people if they would be involved in the next iteration of the modeling, people who can help us with the assumptions and people who can help us with some of the ADOPT questions as well. So I think, David, I've managed to keep within time.
Harry. Round of applause to Harry. Not only did you keep within time, Harry, you were under time, so that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Next speaker is Richard Eckard, Chair of Carbon Farming, University of Melbourne, also called the grandfather of carbon farming in Australia, for better or worse. Science leader in Net Zero's NZACC, science advisor to a whole pile of governments around the world. Richard's going to talk to us about inhibitors. Richard.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk, being asked to talk about the role of inhibitors. I was expecting to talk about nitrous oxide inhibitors and not methane inhibitors, but perhaps that terminology about the grandfather kind of describes where I sit. I'm not an expert on inhibitors per se, but I do spend a lot of time placing them in a context of an overall strategy. And so that's probably what I'm going to talk about today, is where do they fit and what are some of the challenges associated with that. By the way, the last introduction I had was the godfather of carbon farming, which is like, get your account right or else I'll kneecap you. So it brings me to, now don't judge too heavily on what I'm presenting here. It's just trying to sort of get thinking going. What we seldom see in peer-reviewed papers is an explanation or hard evidence of the mode of action. We've been guilty of doing a lot of cause and effect research, poke this in and see what happens, but then speculate about the outcome. So I had a bit of a rough go at saying, well, can we categorize our modes of action on dietary additives on the mode of action? In other words, Bovier and bromoform, pretty much enzyme inhibitors. If you look at nitrate and sulfate, they're hydrogen sinks. So the reason why I'm doing this is you start understanding where Harry was going with stacking, because we're very poor on stacking research. So how do we understand what may or may not stack? You know, oils, for example, might actually be hydrogen blockers. They actually create a physical barrier between protozoa and methanogens. You might get some antimicrobials like essential oils, polyphenolics, and then a completely different mode of action with pH in the rumen. But making the point here that there's limited evidence in the peer-reviewed literature on the mode of action. Speculation, but not clear evidence. So what are some of the challenges we face with inhibitors? We know that efficacy of an inhibitor is largely limited by its presence or absence in the rumen. In other words, you could take an inhibitor, and if it's present at every microsite enzyme reaction in the rumen 24/7, you can get 100%, in theory, reduction in methane. But therein lies the challenge. The less present it is in our extensive grazing systems, the less opportunity it has to act in the rumen, and their decay time is quite rapid in the rumen. So rumen residence time, passage rate, pharmacokinetics all play a very strong role in why we see such a variance in some studies saying 80% reduction in methane and some saying 30%. We haven't applied the correct model. Harry touched on this about being cost effective. If we use the shadow price of carbon in Australia, methane reduction is worth about $35 a tonne as a shadow price. If you achieve 40% less methane at $35 a tonne, the pain point for an inhibitor is 7 cents per cow per day. Now, a lot of the inhibitors are 50 cents per cow per day, or bromoform in seaweed form about $1 per cow per day. So we're way off target, and now we want to add a biopolymer to slow release this, which is not going to decrease the cost, it's going to increase the cost. It might increase the efficacy though. Then touching on the thing that Harry touched on about, you know, I know we've done the sales job on the funders over years saying if you reduce methane, you're going to improve productivity. Until Peter Moat Riley pointed out to me that if we if it's 10% gross energy and we save 50% methane, that's 5% gross energy. That's under the standard error in our experiments. So the reason why we don't report it is we can't measure it in most cases. It's a bit the same with nitrous oxide inhibitors. You know, the productivity gain you get from reducing 5 kilos of nitrous oxide, you can't measure it. So it's a bit of the same issue. And then I'm a bit mischievous here and talking about bolus fever, but it's a point I'm making not about boluses, but about how quickly we rush to solutions without carefully thinking it through, that 3-nop for a 12-month bolus is 4 kilos down the throat of an animal. Anyone try to put 4 kilos down the throat of an animal? Kind of doesn't work. And so we had to repivot out of boluses into it's a biopolymer that goes into a pellet. So we've got to be careful of being enthusiastic before we step back and have a serious think about the intervention we're trying to look at. Now, we've all seen this kind of cascade. It's a fairly popular model where we say we have a solution, we have to put it through in vitro to screen it first to say which are the most viable solutions to put into animal trials, which we then go into the rumen and look at in animals. Unfortunately, a lot of the research stops there and bounces to solution without actually saying, well, we got 80% on a TMR diet in a chamber. Does that work when we talk about grazing systems out in the field with less frequent dosing and more competitive interaction between animals? And so we miss this step of in-field confirmation of what we're actually achieving. I think that's missing. And then we distill it down to, well, how do we get to a point where this is useful to the inventory or to offset or inset methods? How can we incentivize farmers? And it has to drop into the meta-analysis part of it, or if we go with the introductory talk, AI might be a way of distilling down, well, what is the essential equation that we can use in an inventory context or in an offset or inset method or some form of recognition? Often we miss that. So I thought I'd step you through a few areas where we've done these meta-analyses, like for Bovier, for example, where we started with 67 peer-reviewed papers, but by the time we distilled it down to papers that actually could be used in a meta-analysis, it came down to 22, which then goes to experimental design. Are we designing experiments in a way that they can actually be used finally to develop some mechanism for crediting farmers? We've also had to come up with a more novel approach to say, well, the dairy database is not enough to develop a statistically significant equation. The beef is not enough on its own. Can we be smart about how we combine the data sets to get something that is statistically significant? But what it means is you have to do it on a relative mean difference basis, which in the end actually is probably the way we should be going. So we've completed that. But then when we came to look at bromoform, I think the paper that I was talking to Peter Fennessy yesterday about this paper, where we both concluded the same. If you look at the data set on the left, especially at the lower end of the rate, there's such variance in the data set that you're not going to get a statistically significant equation with 2 dairy studies, 2 beef studies, 1 sheep study. Now, there's a lot being published at the moment about bromoform, but we are yet to get to a point where there are enough useful studies to publish any form of recognition equation out of all the research that's been done. On the other side, I know it's not an inhibitor as such, but there's significant meta-analyses around lipids, oils, for example. So we probably know as much as we need to know about them, except for the mode of action being correctly described. What we do know is that both those meta-analyses that I've got on the graph there pretty much said the same thing. Well, they were analysing the same data, I guess, so they should have said the same thing. But for every 1% added fat, we're getting about 3.5% less methane. Which brings me to a missing point in a lot of the work we do, where we do a lot of the work in chambers or in confinement systems or on perhaps not relevant diets to the grazing systems. So we had to go at saying, well, how can we come up with a model to predict what happens if you pulse feed an animal less frequently? And this is a paper we've just published on a meta-analytical approach for estimating methane, where we look at the methane concentration over time, the rate response, the diminishing returns rate response, and integrate those in a first-order equation to come up with a methane suppression over time. And the data you're seeing is put through the bromoform analysis, not the bromoform, the 3-nop analysis we did. So what's not built into this equation, and I welcome the second step of this, is transition from a TMR diet to a grass-based diet, we know that there are issues there, and you can't simply translate. But at least this gives us a way of saying, if we have enough data in chambers, we can predict what will happen in a less frequent dosing regime in grazing. So where do we go from here? There is no one silver bullet. I know we all love to hear there is a silver bullet, but there is no such thing. And most of the interventions have focused on single interventions rather than multiple interventions where we can understand the stacking. Now, we understand why that happens, because it's expensive enough to run a methane trial on its own with one intervention, let alone run it with multiple interventions that have three-way interactions. But where do we need data? We need to understand how to stack these options. So what's potentially stacking? Well, we probably can't stack bromoform and bovier because they have a similar mode of action. We probably can't even stack nitrate and bovier because, well, bovier leaves hydrogen spare in the rumen, and if you poke in nitrate that merely soaks up that hydrogen, you haven't moved forward at all. What's potentially complementary? If we add bovier with oil or tannin or vaccine, or breeding objective is potentially additive with a number of these inhibitors. But what we've already found that is not fully additive, we did research on oils, we did research on tannins. Got 15% from each of them, but when we added the two together in grape mark, we got 20%. So clearly, some of these interventions are they're complementary but not additive. So we need to understand these mechanisms so we can then take it to an adoption level, and what Harry really needs to finalize the adopt model is what actually truly stacks. Harry touched on early life programming, and I think we lack a lot of understanding in this area. We've just submitted a review on early life programming. One of our students did a fairly comprehensive review on the subject, and we questioned whether inhibitors are actually even useful in early life programming, because they're not an archaicide. They might reduce methanogen numbers, but they don't get rid of them. And that's what came out of our review. And what also came out of the review is there's at least 3 separate points of intervention in the rumen that each have their own mechanism and mode of action. And we've probably only focused on one of those 3, or perhaps 2 of them, but not all 3. So I think there's a lot to understand still with early life programming in our understanding, and I commend this review to you. So to finish off, I found yesterday there was a lot of dancing around this insetting idea, but no one getting to the heart of the issue about, is there a business model on how this can work? How do we get farmers to the point where they can actually get rewarded for feeding inhibitors? And this is something that's getting a lot of traction in Australia and the US at the moment. Is this concept of an insetting model. Because you ask a question, who wants a slice of your carbon as a farmer? Well, it's the bank. They've set a target. It's the meat company, it's the dairy processor, it's the fertilizer company. They've all set targets. We're aware of those targets, but what they haven't realized is that they are codependent on each other because they all set the target for the same farm. Their 30% that they've each set is all the same farm, but they've never sat in a room and figured out what the business model looks like. So we're starting to broker getting those industries together in a room and saying, let's figure out what the business model looks like, because inhibitors are too expensive to feed, but not if everyone gets involved. So where we at is we're using the shadow price approach that Harry was talking about, where we're saying, well, that the carbon at the farm has a value, potentially $35 a tonne for a low carbon product coming through this, or something that's reduced its methane. So it's not a zero-sum game for the farmer anymore. The idea that it all passes down to the farmer isn't actually what we're seeing. It's not the reality. It's not their target. It's the supply chain, the value chains that have set a target. And so we're working on a possible solution. If you look up the idea of a supply shed, it's a virtual cooperative that we form within an industry, a group of suppliers in a defined market. And the farmer comes along and puts the QR code of their 30% less emissions QR code into the pot, and that's their contribution. The supply chain comes along and says 4 cents a kilo live weight. The bank comes along and says 0.25 interest rate. And by the time you've mixed the pot, you actually have a value proposition that is close to $35 a tonne. So we've got this dialogue going because what you're seeing is inhibitors are prohibitively expensive and they don't confer productivity gains. So how are we going to get adoption? And so we've started seeing one of the major consultancy firms in the US take this up quite seriously. We've brokered conversation in red meat. We've got a project there where Woolmarker's got a project out at the moment. Dairies started one, cotton and grains have all started a project around this. Having this sensible dialogue, we've set targets. How are we going to get there? We are all sharing the target. The supply chain, the value chain all have the same target. They have a codependency and they can all share in achieving the target if they come together and work together. So to finish off, hopefully in time, I think we need more information on the use of inhibitors, whether they're even useful in early life programming. We need more understanding of stacking options, on which inhibitors can actually stack with other mitigation options. How do we deliver an extensive grazing? You've got to remember that for Australia, 1/3 of our livestock never see a human until they're mustered for market. The idea of feeding them something on a daily basis is a foreign concept. So if you don't even know where they are or how many there are, turns out we've probably got 5 million more head in Australia than we thought we had. What are the cost-effective business models for adoption? Because it has to be a value proposition for all parties that need to achieve their target. Turns out that if you're a red meat supplier and everyone else is taking their share, it probably only costs you 4 cents a kilo live weight to achieve the $35 a tonne in the pot, if I can put it that way. What are the methods for crediting producers? How do we recognise these inhibitors in inventory equations? How do we recognise them for offsets or insets and credible co-claiming? So hopefully that made sense.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Thank you both for your comments. Really informative presentations, prompted a lot of questions. So the one that came to the top was around carrots and sticks. The actual question was modelling, but I think the question's probably broader than that. So perhaps we'll start with Harry and then move to you next, Richard. What does the modelling tell us about carrots and sticks that should be used by governmental processes, penalties and subsidies? Perhaps we can broaden the question out though, because it seems to be a general area. What are we learning about carrots and sticks? What are we learning about the sort of approaches that need to be taken? Now I know you've just finished your presentation talking about that, but we might get you to add a bit more to that. But Harry, what is the model starting to tell us about that?
I don't think the model gives us any insights we didn't already know. It's very difficult to persuade a business owner to voluntarily reduce their profits, especially in a situation where their profits aren't very high in the first place. And so what the modelling is telling us is that if a technology is going to cost money, you're going to have an inverse relationship with adoptability. I don't think it tells us much more than that, to be very truthful. So it does give that challenge of we can have technically efficient solutions, but they're not economically efficient solutions. So how do we get over that barrier? Because unless we do, we're in danger of developing this whole suite of technologies that are going to sit on a shelf.
So Richard, you're trying some really interesting things, interesting experiments, interesting thought experiments. What advice would you have for New Zealand on the sort of approach we should be taking to carrots and sticks?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, the difference between the two countries. Australia's always had an incentive mechanism rather than a penalty mechanism. And so going to talk to a bunch of producers in Northern Australia is a lot easier when it's not mandatory or it's not a threat of a tax or there's an incentive basis. But still, where we've gone with our conversation with farmers is it's not about government targets in Australia. It's about the supply chain. Look at their targets. The average supply chain, value chain company has a 30% target starting in 2030. And that gets the farmers engaged because we use this thing called the 3 Ps of climate change, where we used it to communicate with farmers that are resistant to the science of climate change. We say, well, the first P is the physical impact. Well, you might say that that doesn't exist, but the policy implications are real, and the peripheral or people side of it is real. So that's where you get the conversation going, and they say, well, what is the supply chain target? How am I going to meet that supply chain target? And to be honest, emissions intensity is a far easier conversation to have because they might not be able to change the numerator, but they can change the denominator.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Moving on to another topic, because we had a bit of time. Thanks, gentlemen, for such fast presentations. We've seen massive pushback from consumers in the media on inhibitory substances, methane inhibitors. Are consumers' sentiments considered in the modelling and in the strategies? talked a bit about farmer adoption here, but what about consumer acceptance and consumer adoption? Richard, do you want to go first this time?
I think we do have quite a lot of misconceptions out there. I had to do 3 fact checks on that just in the last few days. The story going around the EU at the moment about Bovier, completely unfounded, but it gets traction fairly quickly. So you think about talking to producers about, let's take bromoform versus 3-nop. 3-nop, completely synthetic chemical. If you're regenerative organic, you can't feed a completely benign chemical. Bromoform is a natural product out of seaweed, so it's okay. And that just leads to consumer perception that might be completely misguided in the long term. So I think we've got a lot of work to do in convincing consumers that the interventions are going to be safe.
Yeah, the model we use doesn't directly address that because in a sense, it asks the user of the technology, would it take up that technology? But some of the questions actually address consumer perceptions, they address risk profiles, they also address animal welfare, all of those things. So those things are implicit rather than explicit, so they are taken into account. And I think it really is an important area, and I've got people from Dairy NZ in the room, and when we did some early work with Bovier, and there was a small survey attached to some of that work, which asked farmers whether they would use it, it asked consumers. And interestingly enough, quite a lot of farmers said they would not use chemical interventions, they didn't want to use them in their things. And a considerable proportion of consumers said they would not purchase products with that had been fed with chemical inhibitors. So I think it's something we've got to be massively aware of, that it comes from both sides. It comes not only from the consumer side, but there will be farmer reluctance as well for a whole host of reasons. So it is something we do have to be completely aware of. And I think the other problem we have is the misinformation problem, because the weekend fuss was really around ALA, and if you're actually looking at a product that has been well researched, I think it is a real example of how you should approach the development of a product in terms of the amount of research that's been done, the amount of work that's been done on safety, efficacy, etc., and you're still getting misinformation campaigns coming out of the press. And you can't overcome that. And you know, the pictures on TikTok of people pouring milk down the drain and said, I'm not going to buy that because it's fed an inhibitor, without any evidence that there's any residue of that inhibitor in the milk at all.
Thank you. And while on the topic of managing perceptions and people-related issues, how will you manage the risk of this work informing overly optimistic assumptions by ministers and officials that lead to unrealistic climate policy ambitions? Harry, do you want to start with that fun question?
It's a big one.
Ooh. Yes. And that's why I was very, very careful to caveat virtually everything I said. Because there is you do have to be careful that the government, industry are investing heavily into this area. They don't want to hear a story that says we're investing heavily, and unfortunately that's not leading to success. So you do have to take care of this. So we have tried to be as careful as possible with our assumptions. We have tried not to over-assume on efficacy. We've tried to think realistically on cost, and we're trying to use a model that, to say we're not assuming that every technology gets taken up by every farmer in every situation. And so moving to use a behavioral model like Adopt inherently brings in some, I think, realism into it, because I've seen too many reports, and particularly the global reports. And I'm someone who's been involved in AR5, AR6. I've been involved in a couple of FAO reports. And they assume 100% adoption of all technologies throughout the world in every system. So please ignore all those things about how we're going to reduce emissions by this much, because they're not realistic. So I think what we're trying to do with the approach, with the Adopt model and the inputs to the Adopt model, is to not oversell this, to actually be as realistic as possible within the that complexity and level of degree of uncertainty that we inevitably have.
Richard, do you want to add to that?
I can't add to that because I fully agree. The other side is undoing the damage created. Soil carbon in Australia is a classic, where someone sold a minister on the fact that if we could increase soil carbon across the whole of Australia by 0.01%, we would solve all the climate change issues. They didn't realise the 0.01 is 50% of the time is negative 0.01. So actually, no, it's not possible. And to try and undo that damage, because it's an easy sales job to a politician, and then it's soil carbon is going to save the day, and we're still trying to unpick that.
So one last question before I hand over. In light of the fact that in 50 years' time, most of the people in this room will no longer be around, which is perhaps a pessimistic lead into the question, so let's turn it a bit more optimistic. What are the strategies we can adopt to ignite undergrads, grads' passions to tackle these critical issues? Two researchers of long-standing sitting here, what's your view on how do you light the fire for young people coming into science?
Well, because you delayed, I'll go first. It's one of the reasons we've gone down the route of the net zero CRC in Australia. Because I use the analogy, the rumen only took 50 million years to evolve to a steady state. And we throw 3-year funding rounds at it and hope for the best. That's a ridiculous, Anyway, so we put in this bid for a 10-year program. And what we're trying to give is the next generation at least a 10-year run at a career. I think our short-term thinking around funding has been part of the big problem bringing another generation through who can get more security in the IT industry or the ChatGPT industry or whatever. So we've got to give them some sort of security of 10 years, some pathway. The other thing we notice in all major universities in Australia, and I think it's a trend around the world, is the new recruits are coming in more with an environmental science desire rather than agriculture desire. And so we're recruiting more postgrads out of environmental science into methane research than we are out of agriculture. So we might be looking in the wrong spot for our next set of graduates.
Thank you. Harry?
I don't think I have a lot more to add, but I think fundamentally you've got to have a well-funded and stable science system. And I think that the lessons we've learned certainly from the NZAGRC, which is now 15 years, going on 16 years, is that we were given a 10-year contract by the government. And that led us to have stable funding. It led us to be able to give researchers the assurance of long-term funding. It gave us the ability to think about capability development. It also gave us the option to think about infrastructure development. So I think when we're thinking about careers, we've got to first of all think about the science funding system and how we develop stable funding, but also you've got to make it attractive. You've got to, you get students in, but what's the career prospect after they've been a student? So we do need to think of this long-term career structure within science, and it's not a mill for postdocs who then come in, then they don't have a stable career. So to me, it's very much around stable long-term funding. And not constant switches and reforms of the science system every 5 minutes.
Thank you both. I'm now going to hand over to Sinead Leahy, Principal Scientist at the AGRC. But before I do, one last round of applause for the two speakers, please.